Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rebecca Sosa, and I'm currently studying at Moravian Theological Seminary to become a pastor.
I'm Will Saucer. I have a degree in biochemistry and molecular biology, and I've been an atheist since I was 13.
We happen to be twins who both went through the same confirmation class, and it set us on two very different paths. So we've decided that since there's not really a lot of dialogues out there on the internet, it's more of a one-sided critique of another side. Following in suit with Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria, we've decided to completely disband that. We want to make a dialogue so that we can actually talk about these things. Because if each is the master of its own domain, then that cuts the dialogue. So today we're going to be tackling free will.
There's two main schools of thought in philosophy about free will. There's determinism, where a divine or physical force basically guides every human action, and the choices you make are just a reflection of that. And libertarian free will, which is the idea that you control your destiny and you control the choices that you make. And then there's a third option that most people fall into, which is compatibilism, which is the idea that a lot of it is your environment and physical or divine choices that force what you do, and some of it is your own free will, it's your own volition.
Yes, to go along with that, compatibilists are often called soft determinists because they take kind of the best of both worlds. So, and in the link in the description of this video, I have a video linking to the crash course on philosophy, where it goes further into detail about libertarianism and hard determinism. So feel free to check that out. You can pause the video and open it up in a new tab if you'd like to join the conversation. But now we're going to move into talking about some of the schools of philosophy within religion and some of the schools of philosophy that tackle this concept within the atheist world or the agnostic world, depending on what camp you fall into.
The secular world.
The secular world. Much better stated. So I guess I'm going to start off the conversation with John Calvin. Prior to that, we have Luther, but I think Calvin is a little bit more prominent when we're talking about predestination because there's the Calvinistic view. He was a French theologian who believed in predestination, which is the doctrine or belief that all events have been willed by God, usually with reference to the eventual fate of an individual soul. So in the Westminster Confessional of Faith, God has freely and unchangeably ordained whatsoever comes to pass. So it's very kind of a hard and fast rule. Within this idea, people are determined before they're even born. We know if you're going to go to hell or not. So it's just kind of one of those things. Some Calvinist churches or churches that continue to accept the Calvinist school of thought are the Reformed Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the United Church of Christ. And you can check out their doctrines and their books of discipline and see more specifically the wording. That's not a hard and fast rule for all of them. They just happen to fall under the Calvinistic kind of way of thinking. Predestination within churches, as you can imagine, is a bit taboo in that the second way that this word is defined is in regards to soul salvation or who gets to go to heaven. I'm going to pull out also another really great book on some of the views on free will. This one also has a fourth view, which we're not really going to get into because it's not quite as popular and it would become a much longer video. This is the 4 views on free will, and I'm going to have a link to this in the description if you would like to check that out. But one of the critiques that Wesley had for Calvin is that predestination is often thought in terms of God's determination of who is saved, but it also is used to describe God's determination of other circumstances as well. And that's, I think, probably just the best way to address the Calvinistic school of thought with that. Basically, predestination within churches is a bit taboo because it's essentially who gets to go to heaven or not in some cases. Predestination is often thought of in terms of God's determination of who is saved, but it also is used to describe God's determination of other circumstances as well. So I think that that's really what a lot of churches are talking about with predestination. It's that school of thought that we spoke about just a few minutes ago, that hard determinism, that all events are caused by past events such that nothing other than what does occur could occur. So kind of the philosophy that everything happens for a reason, as in everything was set in motion, this ball of wax was set in motion with the exact idea of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, and God is in control of all of that. That's what a lot of people are talking about when they're talking about predestination. It doesn't necessarily have to be about heaven and hell or any of those kinds of school of thoughts of the afterlife. But so that's kind of the philosophy that goes along with it. But one quote in response from John Wesley is, "There can be no moral good or evil unless they have liberty as well as will." And that's kind of the dialogue that occurs between a couple different theologians, is how do we tackle the idea that there's no free will, but that we must choose to follow God. And so that's something that a lot of the reformist thinkers, when after Luther put his 95 Theses on the door of the church, and started kind of this other big event in history where we were finally allowed to break free from the constraints of what we thought of church and how we understood church, and we were able to question things. One of the biggest debates that occurs, other than baptism, is predestination, and how we can justify having a God who requires of us to choose to follow him and obey his word, as well as a God who determines all action and knows beforehand what you're going to choose. How can we have free will and choice? So that's something that a lot of people tackle. And Martin Luther, as I said, he was a German theologian with the 95 Theses on the door. He believed in predestination, but also believed that there was justification through faith alone. And that's kind of the main point of his argument. And I went a little bit out of order. Historically, Luther was writing before Calvin, but it just seemed kind of appropriate to start off with Calvin, since he is kind of the Mac Daddy of Calvinism. So in Luther's work on bondage of the will, he wrote it as a response to Desiderius Erasmus's On Free Will. And Erasmus was actually writing, he was a Dutch Renaissance humanist and a theologian who believed that we do have free will and that humans have the freedom of choice. Luther's response to him, besides writing this paper, was also to claim that Erasmus was not a real Christian on the bondage of free will. That was one of his main arguments, that to believe that God is not in control of all things means that you don't believe in God. So, both men, ironically, based their arguments off of biblical texts, and that's something that you see a lot. Erasmus did have a rebuttal after Luther's response to his work, but it was not very popular, and so not very many people read it. Another thing, I'm going to just read this quote quick. And I think it also kind of captures this difficulty of how can we justify having God that allows us to choose, and also a God that knows everything and knows the choices beforehand. God is not a prisoner of his own plan that we see worked out in the church, or of the logic and moral order in which he executes the plan. So I think that idea of God as a prisoner goes most closely with deism, which was the religion of the founding fathers, the majority of them. And it's this idea, it's a belief in the existence of a supreme being, specifically of a creator who does not interfere in the universe. And so one of the responses, this is the Theology of John Calvin by Karl Barth, and so his response was that God is not held prisoner by these ideas, but he can act intermittently through them. So I think that kind of is an interesting point when you take into account the deist perspective. And another movement was the Anabaptist movement that was characterized by the fundamental belief in free will of men and belief in the believer's baptism. They did not believe in infant baptism. They believed that you needed to make a conscious choice. And some orders that still follow this are the older order of the Mennonites and the Amish, And I know this is a doctrine that had become popular throughout many churches as time went on, but when it was first introduced, it was met with some heavy criticism. So I guess I'll throw the ball back over to you. That's kind of a brief history, not super in-depth and not all-encompassing, but just kind of a good jumping-off point for us as far as determinism and predestination. So I will toss back over.
So I looked at 4 different people who've written on this subject, philosophers who are either self-professed atheists or agnostics, or just, writing from a secular perspective. So I'm going to start with who I consider the first official atheist to write about determinism, and his name is Baron de Holbach. I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's French, which I never studied. And he was writing in the 1770s. He was a naturalist philosopher, and he wrote the book The System of Nature in 1770. And in this book, he basically lays out what he believes is atheistic determinism. And I'm going to start with a quote. "The faculties which are called intellectual, and those qualities which are styled moral, have been explained in a manner purely physical and natural." He, in the Enlightenment, said that as we learn more about the natural world, we find out that humans are a part of the natural world, and the forces of physics and nature and chemistry basically determine how we feel and what we do. And this is sort of the standard argument that atheists who are determinists will make. In fact, you see this in my next philosopher I'm going to talk about, Sam Harris, who is sort of famous now for being a determinist. He's sort of famous for arguing against free will as a concept. And he takes where de Holbach left off and sort of runs with it with more data that we get from the field of neuroscience. And so he basically, his whole argument is that freedom is an illusion that our mind kind of makes. And his argument with that is so much of the choices you make and your ideas and stuff come from unconscious sources. Your brain, the majority of it functions unconsciously. You don't actively think about your cognitive functions, you just sort of are the result of them. And so free will can't exist because the majority of your thoughts and actions are unconscious. You don't choose to do them. So next I'm going to talk about people who I wouldn't argue are libertarian philosophers at all. They don't subscribe to strictly a libertarian free will concept, but they're more compatibilists. They support the idea that you do make some choices on your own volition. And so I'm going to start with Michael Shermer, who's one of my favorite public speakers. He's the chief editor of Skeptic magazine. And he wrote a paper in American Scientific, article in American Scientific called Free Won't. And he argues that with our understanding of modern neuroscience, yes, we do have complicated neural networks that function on chemical and physical bases, but when it comes right down to it, we neurologically can override a lot of basal ideas and a lot of basal impulses just by having concepts that we won't do. He speaks, in his example, he says, would I rather eat the steak and have a stout beer, eat french fries with my steak and all that? Yes, every part of your brain wants you to do that. It wants you to take in as many calories as you can. But we also know that that's a bad idea, and so we can override that and order the salad instead. So what he argues is that there are things we won't do and things we can choose not to do, and that is the crux of free will. And I'm also going to talk for a little bit about Patricia Churchland, who is a modern-day philosopher. She works...
I believe she's from Canada?
Yeah. Links about her will be in the description.
Yes.
And she is very much in the same camp Michael Shermer's in. There's self-control, and our self-control, our ability to basically determine what actions we're going to do and what actions we won't take part in, is basically the basis of free will. And while there are a lot of things we can't help in our brain, there are a lot of things we can say yes or no to. And that's sort of what remnants of free will we have in these arguments. So links to those papers and websites will be in the description below. So
thank you. One thing that I find really interesting when we're talking about kind of predestination and free will, or determinism and libertarian free will, is that in both fields, we've got, religious people on both sides trying to determine, do we have free will? Is everything determined? And that's something that's followed over into the secular world as well. Because Sam Harris, you said, argues against having free will. He argues for more of a hard determinist view. And I think that's really interesting, that on both sides you've got the libertarian free will, hard determinism, and the compatibilists. So
it basically, Sam Harris is a lot like John Calvin. He believes that there's not a single choice you make of your own volition, but for John Calvin, it's a divine force, a spiritual force. It's God who's, manipulating every molecule in the universe. And for Sam Harris, it's just chemicals and physics, and you're sort of just an artifact of natural forces, and therefore you don't really have free will.
I think it's also really interesting when you look at Churchland and kind of that line of thought that it's more of a compatibilist, that we do have some choices and some things that we can determine, and that really falls in line. I personally think with Wesley, although I am completely biased as a Methodist, I really want Wesley to be the guy that believes similarly to a more modern theologian. But I think that Churchland's works kind of fall in line with some of those reformist thinkers, and I didn't really get a chance to go very much into a lot of the more modern or contemporary theologians as far as free will, because most of the really juicy stuff, if you will, is from around the Reformation, and so that's where the largest body of work is, and I wanted to make sure to get that in the video and not have the video be 3 hours long. So unless you're watching this and it is 3 hours long, in which case I apologize, but thanks for sticking with us. So it's really just interesting to see that no matter what time period or what field you're in, whether the secular or the religious, that everybody's kind of trying to make sense of all of these things together. So we had to go grab our Bibles, because the next section of the video is actually going to be us taking a look at some of the more notorious verses where it kind of appears that God has potentially messed with or done something to the free will of characters in the Bible. So the most notorious is probably the story in Exodus when God hardens the Pharaoh's heart. So we're going to take a look at Exodus chapter 9, verses 10 through 12. And I'm going to read them, and they're going to pop up on the screen as well. So they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them, and all of the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. So you've got this idea a couple of times throughout this narrative of God hardening the Pharaoh's heart and essentially changing the will of the character, the Pharaoh. So I guess the question is, how do we kind of take that, and how does that fall into the worldview? Is this him taking away the free will of a character?
From this story, it seems that God is basically being the puppeteer. Here he's having Moses and Aaron do stuff, and then he has the Pharaoh doing stuff, and it makes for a great story, but I think this is a direct example in the Bible of God manipulating a situation directly. So
yes, it does really fall into that hard determinism, and if you read through some of the theologians that we've already discussed, you see all of them using different Bible verses to combat the idea that God either does or does not infringe upon the free will of people. And I think this is just one of those verses that always really stood out as a verse in which God is encountering, God is actually manipulating the free will of somebody in the story. So we're going to jump straight to verses 33 to 35. Then Moses left Pharaoh and went out of the city. He spread out his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. So in this one, I think what's interesting is it moves from God hardening the Pharaoh's heart, and here it says, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. And we are reading from the New International Version. I know it varies slightly depending on which version you're looking at, but I think it's kind of interesting that there's this shift again, and this time it's no longer God infringing upon the will of a human. It's interesting because I've read different arguments that explain or try and combat the idea that God has hardened the Pharaoh's heart as an infringement on his free will. And I just am not sure how compelling any of these arguments would be within a secular community. What do you think how do you think this would be received within a secular community?
From just a secular perspective, I view this as a really nice story. It's a religion arguing amongst itself within a story, and it's good theater. I mean, I don't think any secularist would be persuaded to be getting into religion because of this story, though. It's very much a Jewish people, telling a great story about their history and about their heritage, and they're talking about how great their God is and how powerful he is because he can manipulate so many things and controls the outcome of all sorts of situations. But from a secular perspective, it's just an interesting story.
I really like what you said there, that it's kind of the religion arguing with itself. And I think for a lot of people, those different verses that seem to contradict one another or seem to contradict a great idea, like a grand theological perspective within the Bible, I think a lot of those are where people get their hang-ups, when in all reality this text was written over a great span of time. And the thing that I appreciate so much about the Old Testament, and specifically the Torah, is that they didn't really get rid of anything. That's why you've got two creation stories in Genesis 1 and then again in Genesis 2. And that's why you've got kind of these differing perspectives when you look at the different tribes that were separated. And I just think that you said the religion arguing with itself, and I think that that's like spot on what this is. It's them trying to work it out as well.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah.
Thank you. All right, and let's look at, next we're going to move on to, I'm actually making this podcast, we've discussed making this podcast for a while, but it kind of, the thing that put the fire under us to get it done is I'm taking a class at seminary called Isaiah the Fifth Gospel, where we examine the book of Isaiah in a more in-depth way. And the paper that I'm going to be writing is on Isaiah chapter 6, verses 8 to 13. So we're going to pull those up. And what's interesting about this verse is it's a very, very well-known verse because right beforehand you've got kind of the introduction to Isaiah, and you've got this famous story and this famous narrative within the Bible that everybody knows. There's the song, Here I Am, Lord. And the thing that we don't realize is right after Isaiah accepts his call to serve God and to deliver God's message, you've got this interesting play going on where it seems to be that God is changing the will of the people. So we're going to read this verse and then discuss it. Isaiah chapter 6, verses 8 to 13. Then I heard the voice of the Lord say, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. He said, Go and tell the people. Be ever hearing, but never understanding. Be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused. Make their ears dull, and close their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Then I said, For how long, Lord? And he answered, Until the cities lie ruined and without inhabitant, and until the houses are left deserted and the fields ruined and ravaged. until the Lord has sent everyone away, far away, and the land is utterly forsaken. And though a tenth remains in the land, it will again be laid waste. But as the terebinth and oak leaves stumps, when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. So you've got a lot going on in this passage. Do you have any first impressions of this passage?
I think I'd like a setup here. So why is God trying to confuse everyone?
That is a really good point, and that's when I first read this verse in class. I had read Isaiah a couple years ago, but read it with more of a Christian or a Christocentric perspective of somebody reading it as a Christian, this Old Testament text that's a Hebrew text. And I just didn't really think anything of this when I first read it. But when we were reading it again in class, the first thing that I thought is, why would God stop the ears of the people and make their hearts calloused and make their ears dull and close their eyes? Why would God want to do all of those things when they could be saved? And you see this idea also in the book of Jonah, where Jonah is called to go and speak to the people, and he doesn't really want to go. Here you've got Isaiah say, send me, I'm volunteering. But Jonah didn't want to go, and God sent him, and the story, swallowed by the whale, all the good stuff. But in the end, the people repented, and Jonah was still not happy about that. But the people did have the opportunity to repent. And here you've got kind of a similar setup where it's, I'm sending you to deliver a message. But here, God is saying that I'm not going to let the people receive or understand this message.
To be a little cynical here, it almost sounds like they're saying, hey, when you go and try to convert people, if they don't want to hear it, if they don't like it, that's okay. That's what I want anyway. So it almost sounds like you can never fail if you're trying to be a missionary in this passage.
See, and that's what's so interesting. In my paper, I also look at this verse as how it would be read and interpreted within a missionary perspective. And this was a very popular verse during the missionary movement. And when you had all of these people, they wrote the song, and it encouraged all these young people to go out and be missionaries. And I think that this would have an effect on their temperament, particularly when dealing with frustrating situations, or perhaps people where the culture is so different that they're not able to relate to them in a way that they can understand. So, and if you read the Donovan's book on rediscovering Christianity, you see him combat that by kind of removing the culture from the gospel. But you've got removing culture from the gospel in the sense that he's trying to remove cultural barriers that would prevent people from being able to understand it within their own minds and cultures and interpretations. So here you've got almost a free, like, Disney fast pass to not worry about it if you do get frustrated. So yeah. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost like another passage I've read in the Bible where Jesus tells his followers, people are going to say that this is, they don't believe this and this sounds ridiculous. And it almost sounds like he's basically saying, if you tell anyone else about your religion, they're going to think you're crazy. This is kind of like this. I feel like the person writing this is like, it's okay, God understands that people don't want to hear me, and, it's okay if you're trying to convert people and they don't want to hear it or do or have anything to do with you because, it says right here that's okay. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I hadn't considered the application of this Old Testament text into the New Testament, but I believe the verse you're talking about is in John, and there is that element of, hey, it's us versus them kind of.
Yeah, I study a lot of different religions, and I do have a very atheist perspective, but a lot of these religions where they tell you to go out and convert people, there's usually a passage that says, it's okay if they don't want to hear it though, you're right anyway.
Yeah. And to kind of bring in other elements, I believe in the 3rd surah of the Quran, there are some verses that kind of say, if you tell somebody about this and they don't believe you, then you're completely justified in ostracizing them, or in some cases defending yourself physically. So it's very interesting. Just to look again at the verse 9 through, hang on a second. Just to look again at verse 9 and 10, we've got, he said, "Go and tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding, be ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their ears dull and close their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed." He's kind of saying, go and... One interpretation is that God is giving Isaiah a heads up that these people aren't going to receive him, but at the same time, it sounds, when you read it through in a more of a literal way, it does sound like God is saying, I'm going to make these people calloused, and I'm going to make these people not hear your message that I'm sending you to deliver. So
yeah, it's really confusing. I think, again, this is one of those go get them, but, you're right, everyone else is wrong, so don't feel bad if they don't want to listen to you, and don't feel bad if you end up, making people not want to convert to your religion. And you see this a lot in, more modern religious texts.
Yeah, another interesting thing is that this is kind of a precursor to the exile. So is this written later on after the exilic period, when people are trying to justify why the exile happened? Because it was very difficult for the people, and the exile occurred for the upper class, not so much the lower class, but this upper class group of people were essentially taken from their land, and they wouldn't be returned until Cyrus. So, interesting. Well, I'm going to move forward from this then. Thanks for speaking with me about the verses, and thank you so much for doing this with me and being the atheist and the pastor together. And just one thing to kind of close this out is to just kind of talk about having a dialogue, because so much we watch a lot of atheist YouTube together because they're just all really, really awesome. Not to I know if you're into a little vulgarity, and by a little I mean quite a bit of vulgarity. The atheist Bible study is something that I've grown to really appreciate, because it's interesting viewing the text that I'm familiar with from another perspective. So earlier I mentioned Stephen Jay Gould and his idea of non-overlapping magisteria, which is the idea that if you kind of have religion here and science here and they don't touch, then it's okay, because each can kind of be the king of his own castle. And I think that really does cut off the dialogue. And so one of the things that you're seeing now is on campuses, there are a lot more interfaith diversity dialogues going on, where they have representatives from all of these religions, but you also see an increase in secular representatives, particularly on our undergraduate campus. And you're seeing these kinds of discussions occurring more and more, and I think that it's just great to be able to move forward with this and have an actual dialogue, rather than have, I'm right, you're wrong, and this is why. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to clarify, I'm not speaking from a scientist's perspective right now. I am very much science deals with what we can test and what we can find out about the natural world person. I work in labs, I have a degree in science, I'm looking to get into a more advanced degree in science, and so I have this very science is practical sort of mindset, but once you get into secularism, you can use science, and you can talk about science, and you can talk about how that interferes with, interacts with cultures and religion and politics and all that minutia. Yeah. So
thank you for the clarification. Yeah. I know I've kind of used, I just usually reference Stephen Jay Gould, because he's kind of one of the pioneer writers on this, so it just seems to fall a little bit more easily into the conversation. But
and he was in the episode of The Simpsons.
Yes, he was. Anyway, do you have any more closing statements?
I'd just like to say I'm glad that we're finally doing this. We've talked about it for a while, and I like a good discussion, and I'd like to say, once this is on the internet, in the comments section, Be adults, everyone. Be adults.
Yes, and on that, please feel free to have dialogue and continue the discussion down in the comments below. And we're going to go on and comment as much as we can when we're able to. And thank you so much for watching, and have a beautiful day. Stay tuned for our next episode when we tackle creation and evolution.
Woo!
Thank you.
It'll be fun.